Hey guys, tonight we travel to Charleston, South Carolina, summer of 1823. The air is thick enough to drink. The city is swelling with the scent of salt, sweat, and sin. Out past the cobblestone streets, where the carriages fade into the hiss of crickets, the marshlands breathe. You can almost hear them. Slow, wet, patient. Something beneath the reeds moves when the tide rises, as if the ground itself remembers what was buried there. You probably won't survive this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Wexford plantation stood miles beyond the city, at the edge of the marsh. A pale, rotting mansion perched above its own reflection in the stagnant water. The rice fields stretched out like flooded mirrors, each stalk swaying beneath a sky heavy with thunderflies. The locals called it the house that sweated, because even its bricks seemed to perspire under the heat. In Charleston proper, people spoke the Wexford name in half-whispers. They were an old family, one of the first to bring chains to the Carolina coast. Their wealth was older than law, their cruelty older than memory. But even among their kind, they were avoided. Rumor said their bloodline was cursed, that something in their fields had been fed too long on suffering. That summer, the air felt different. The wind carried rot from the marsh, and even the gulls seemed to keep their distance. At dusk, the slaves returned from the fields silent and slow, their clothes dark with the day's labor. Among them walked Soloman. Taller than most, his shoulders broad from years of forced work, his face unreadable under the twilight. His hands were strong but careful, the hands of someone who once built, not buried. Before Charleston, before the ships and chains, he had been a carpenter's apprentice in Sierra Leone. He could still recall the smell of cedar, the rhythm of his father's tools, the prayers whispered before a cut of wood was shaped. The Wexfords had taken that from him. His language, his name, his craft, but not his memory. He remembered the words for peace and the words for vengeance. Each evening, he was sent to the burial grounds. It was his task to dig graves for the dead, slaves who had collapsed in the fields, or those who had displeased their masters. The Wexfords called it discipline. Soloman called it counting. He dug with precision. Every grave the same width, the same depth, every mound perfectly level. The overseers mocked him for it, called him obsessive, said he worked too clean for a slave. But Soloman had a reason. He marked every grave in his mind. Everyone had a name. Everyone had a debt attached. The marsh wind carried the scent of decay, and as he worked, he whispered in a language no one around him knew. The overseer thought it nonsense. But the others, the ones who'd come from the same coast, knew. They said Soloman was speaking to the dead, that he was calling to the ones lost beneath the ocean. At night, when the Wexford house glowed with candlelight and the sound of a distant piano, Soloman sat by the graveyard's edge and carved small wooden crosses. The wood came from the old rice crates, rough, splintered, but dry. He would shape them with a small blade he'd hidden for years. On each cross, he scratched faint symbols, not letters, but something older. Spirals, lines, curves that met like rivers. He placed one at every grave, whispering over them, his voice low, steady, rhythmic. The others said he was trying to guide their souls, but in truth, Soloman was building something, not of wood, but of balance. Because on that plantation, there was none. The Wexfords owned everything: land, lives, law. Judge Ambrose Wexford, the patriarch, sat on his veranda each evening drinking brandy, while men screamed in the distance. His sons and nephews mimicked him, young men with soft hands and cruel imaginations. They called themselves gentlemen. They called their slaves assets. Sometimes, when the punishments were public, they made Soloman dig the pit before the lash fell. They wanted him to know where his work ended. He never looked up. He never spoke. But he listened. He learned the cadence of their laughter, the way it faltered when lightning struck nearby. He noted which ones prayed and which ones did not. He counted their names: Ambrose, Gideon, Elias, Marcus, Henry, Silas, Abram, Charles, Nathaniel. 9 in all, 9 men of one blood, each wearing the Wexford name like armor. They feasted while others starved. They slept soundly while others wailed. And when they laughed, Solomon's shovel kept rhythm in the soil. By midsummer, strange things began to happen around the plantation. The rice fields refused to grow. The air hung heavy with the scent of iron, and mosquitoes swarmed like living smoke. The overseer's dog vanished one morning. They found its collar near the graveyard fence. The slaves whispered that the marsh was hungry again. Ambrose Wexford blamed them, of course. He ordered more beatings, more punishments, more graves. He believed fear kept the soil fertile. But Solomon knew better. The earth was already feeding. One evening, as the sun sank behind the cypress trees, Solomon stood alone by the burial ground. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant thunder. The air around the graves rippled like heat, though the sun had already set. He knelt and pressed his palm into the damp soil. It was warm, too warm. He whispered a name, one that was not English, one that had crossed the ocean with him. The sound was soft, but the earth seemed to move beneath his hand. Just a breath, just a tremor. The next day, the overseer collapsed in the fields. No wound, no mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he'd seen something terrible just before falling. Ambrose ordered the body burned, but Solomon watched the flames and smiled, only slightly. The overseer's name had been the first carved cross. That night, the frogs fell silent. The wind didn't move. Even the crickets stopped their endless song. The marsh waited. From the veranda, the Wexfords feasted, drinking and laughing as if the world were not turning beneath them. Candles flickered. Laughter echoed. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Solomon stood beneath the cypress tree and whispered again. And this time, something whispered back. A voice, faint as mist, rose from the soil, not one, but many. The air thickened, the marsh trembled, and the crosses he'd planted began to lean ever so slightly toward the house on the hill. Solomon closed his eyes. The words came easily now, ancient syllables wrapped around pain, around patience, around justice. If you'd been there that night, you might have seen it too. The candlelight in the windows flickering, the reflection of 9 shadows across the curtain. Though only 8 stood in the room. By morning, the air smelled like rain and blood, and the marsh it breathed again. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The next morning, the sun rose pale and trembling over the marsh. The mist hung low, curling around the cypress roots like fingers. The air was heavy, sweet with decay. When the field hands gathered, they found the overseer's post empty. His whip still hung from the peg, coiled and clean, as if waiting for a hand that would never return. Ambrose Wexford didn't speak of it publicly. He sent 2 of his nephews to search the property, though everyone knew they wouldn't find much. The man's name was already fading, like the echo of a scream that never reached heaven. Solomon worked the fields as usual. The others watched him, silent, cautious. They noticed he didn't look toward the big house anymore. His eyes were fixed on the soil, his steps deliberate, like a man walking through memory. That night, he returned to the graveyard. The wind from the coast had changed direction. It came inland now, thick with salt. The graves he dug glistened under the moonlight, as though the soil itself was sweating. He crouched by the newest mound, the one belonging to the overseer. The cross stood upright, but the ground beneath it seemed to pulse faintly. He whispered again, words that no one living should have understood, and the air around him began to hum. A figure moved behind him. "Boy," said a voice, slow and drawling. Solomon didn't turn. It was Marcus Wexford, one of Ambrose's kin. The man's breath smelled of rum and spoiled fruit. He carried a lantern that trembled with his hand. "You think I don't know what you're doing out here?" Marcus said. "You think we don't see you whisperin', your heathen trash?" Solomon's hand tightened around the small knife hidden in his sleeve. But he didn't speak. Marcus chuckled, stepping closer. "My uncle says you're his best worker. Says you dig straight and clean. I think that's why he keeps you alive. But me." He leaned in, his voice lower, crueler. "I think you like the graves too much. Maybe you want your own." The lantern light flickered across Solomon's face, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that stopped his grin cold. Not fear, not defiance, but stillness, a kind of knowing. Marcus raised his hand as if to strike him, but the moment froze. From somewhere behind them came a sound, soft, dragging, like fabric across wet leaves. Marcus turned, the light from his lantern swinging wildly. The sound came again. A whisper of movement near the oldest graves. "Who's there?" he barked. No one answered. The sound stopped. Then, from the dark, the faintest voice. A whisper shaped like his name. "Marcus." The lantern flickered. Marcus stumbled back, eyes wide, muttering curses. He turned and hurried up the path toward the house, the flame shaking violently in his hand until it vanished into the night. Soloman didn't move. He waited, listening. The whisper came again, low and deep, as though from beneath his feet. "Not yet," it said. He nodded once and rose. The wind shifted. A heron screamed out in the marsh, sharp, distant, final. By morning, Marcus Wexford was gone. His horse was found wandering near the creek, saddle torn. They searched for him for 2 days before Ambrose ordered it stopped. "The fool probably drowned," he said. But Soloman knew better. He returned to the fields, the shovel in his hand feeling heavier than usual. The other slaves avoided his gaze now. They said when he walked by, the air grew colder. They said he carried the smell of rain, even when the sky was clear. In the great house, Ambrose Wexford sat by the window, staring toward the graveyard through the trees. The rice crop was failing, the overseer was dead, and now one of his kin had vanished. Yet he refused to admit fear. Superstition. He muttered, though his brandy trembled in the glass. Ignorant nonsense. That evening, he ordered the servants to light every candle in the house. The windows blazed like fireflies across the marsh. The sound of the piano rose again, forced and hollow. But in the graveyard, the crosses leaned a little further. That week, the plantation began to change. The air thickened, the wells turned brackish, and the dogs barked through the night at things unseen. The Wexfords argued among themselves. Some wanted to flee to Charleston, others refused to leave. Soloman kept to his work. Every night, he dug. The ground grew softer, as if something below was loosening the soil for him. On the third night, he uncovered something strange. His shovel hit wood where no coffin should have been. He knelt, brushed away the dirt, and saw what looked like the lid of an old chest. The carvings were faint, worn by time, symbols like the ones he had drawn. He opened it carefully. Inside lay small bones bundled in cloth, child bones, and around them, tiny wooden tokens shaped like eyes. Soloman stared silent as the wind began to circle him. He whispered one word, the old word for justice. When he looked up, every cross in the graveyard had shifted, facing the same direction toward the mansion. The next morning, Gideon Wexford woke screaming. His servants found him clawing at his own throat, insisting he could taste the river. By dawn, he was dead, drowned. Though his lungs were dry, Ambrose buried him quickly, ordered the matter unspoken. But the family was unraveling. The others drank more, locked their doors, muttered about curses. Soloman was told to dig another grave. He did, slow, methodical, perfect. When it was done, he placed a cross upon it, whispered the same name 3 times, and walked away without looking back. That night, thunder rumbled far out over the sea. The marsh trembled, the air thick with the scent of salt. The house on the hill glowed faintly against the storm, like a lantern about to go out. Inside, Ambrose Wexford sat alone, staring into the fire. He thought he heard voices outside, faint layered, singing something that wasn't a hymn. He poured another drink. His hand shook. Outside, by the burial ground, Soloman lifted his eyes toward the windows. He whispered again. Not for the dead this time, but for the living who had forgotten what it meant to fear the dark. And somewhere deep in the earth, something answered. If you've stayed this long, would you have looked back? By the 7th night of August, the Wexford estate had turned into something between a house and a fever dream. The walls seemed to sweat even in the absence of heat, and the smell of stagnant water crept in through the cracks of every window. The servants whispered that the house was breathing, that sometimes, if you pressed your ear to the floorboards, you could hear water moving beneath them, like waves beneath a ship. Ambrose Wexford refused to acknowledge it. To him, order was law, and fear was a disease of the weak, so he called his remaining kin together, 8 men, each wearing coats too fine for the weather, and demanded a celebration. A feast, he said, slamming his glass against the table. For our endurance, for our blood, we'll show this cursed marsh what it means to bear the Wexford name. His words tasted like arrogance and whiskey. So that evening, as the marsh hummed with the low drone of frogs and storm clouds gathered far out at sea, the Wexford men dressed for revelry. They wore linen and gold, boots polished to mirrors, and laughter that sounded almost rehearsed. The candles were lit in the great hall, dozens of them, each one dripping wax down into small pools of light that gleamed like bones. The slaves were ordered to prepare the food, though few dared to look up. Soloman was not among them. He had been sent to the lower fields that day, where the mud ran deep and the water stood still. When the sun began to set, he did not return to the house. He went, instead, to the graveyard. The storm clouds rolled closer as he stood among the crosses. The air pressed down heavy, full of the metallic scent of lightning waiting to strike. He placed his hand on the newest mound, Gideon's grave, and began to carve again. His knife moved with slow, practiced care. The cross took shape beneath his fingers, the wood darkened by the damp. He whispered the same ancient words, his breath steady despite the wind. The sky groaned, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside the mansion, the feast began. The table stretched the length of the room, covered in roasted game, fruit, and bottles of imported wine. The chandelier above flickered with whale oil flame, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Henry Wexford, the youngest cousin, tried to make light of the recent misfortunes. He told jokes between mouthfuls of venison, each one thinner than the last. Abram and Silas exchanged uneasy glances, while Ambrose forced his smile to stay in place. When the wind outside howled, Ambrose lifted his glass and said, "Let the storm come. We've weathered worse." The thunder answered him like laughter. And somewhere far below, beneath the polished floorboards, a faint dripping began. Meanwhile Soloman worked. The rain fell harder now, flattening the grass around the graves, but he didn't stop. His voice rose louder, the rhythm of his words syncing with the storm. He carved the 9th cross, the last, and planted it into the ground. As the thunder cracked, the earth beneath him shuddered once, as if something deep below had taken a breath. The candles in the mansion flickered. Charles Wexford looked up from his plate. "Did you feel that?" he asked. Ambrose scowled. "It's wind, you fooled." But then came another sound, a low creak, followed by a faint knocking beneath their feet. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. Knock. Knock. The laughter stopped. "Someone in the cellar," Henry whispered. "No one should be in the cellar," said Silas. "The doors are bolted." Ambrose stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Stay seated," he said, reaching for the pistol on his belt. He crossed the hall, every step echoing as the knocking continued. Knock. Knock. He reached the door leading to the cellar stairs and unlatched it. The hinges groaned as it swung open, revealing a stairwell descending into darkness. A rush of air came up from below, cold, damp, and thick with the smell of earth. Ambrose lifted his lantern. The light flickered over stone steps slick with moisture. The knocking had stopped. "Who's down there?" he called. No answer. He turned back toward the hall, ready to tell his family to fetch torches. But they were no longer at the table. Every chair was empty. The plates of food sat steaming, untouched. The candles burned still, but the air was wrong, too still, too silent. The sound of rain had vanished. And then, from somewhere behind him, came a whisper. Ambrose. He spun, the lantern swinging wildly, its flame stretching the shadows across the wall. No one there. The voice came again, closer this time, right beside his ear. Ambrose Wexford. The lantern slipped from his hand, shattered, and the light went out. Outside, Soloman stood motionless as the rain slowed. The lightning flared once across the horizon, illuminating the mansion in full silhouette. He could see movement in the windows, shadows darting, curtains torn open by unseen hands. The wind shifted. The marsh behind him sighed. He whispered one final word. A name. His true name. The one stolen from him long ago. The thunder answered with a sound like chains breaking underwater. Inside the great hall, Ambrose stumbled in the dark. His breath came fast, his boots slipping on the wet floorboards. The air was thick with the scent of mud. Wet, black mud. Though no rain had entered the house. Something brushed his leg. He looked down and saw a streak of dirt across his trousers. Another. Then another. He looked up just as the far door creaked open. Figures stood in the doorway. 9 of them. Pale, waterlogged, eyes hollow. Their clothes clung to their skin, as though they just emerged from the swamp. Each one bore a resemblance, a crooked smile, a familiar jawline. The Wexfords. All 9 of them. Impossible, Ambrose whispered. The figures stepped forward, dripping. Their mouths opened, and the sound that came out was not speech. It was the sound of earth being shoveled, of graves being filled, of the past demanding to be heard. The candles blew out one by one. Outside, the wind rose again. The storm roared, but beneath it, if you'd been close enough to the graveyard, you might have heard Soloman whisper softly, almost tenderly, "Balance." By dawn, the house was silent. No laughter, no light, no Wexfords. Only the shovel, driven into the wet earth like a headstone. If you've stayed this long, tell me, would you have opened that cellar door? The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't end so much as dissolve, as if the clouds had finally exhaled and lost the strength to continue. The marsh fell into a strange stillness. No frogs, no crickets, not even the whisper of reeds, only the faint lapping of water against the roots. The mansion stood half drowned in fog. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Windows black, shutters hanging loose, the veranda slick with rain. The front door was open, swaying slightly with the morning wind. Soloman stood at the edge of the graveyard, his shirt clinging to his back, his hands caked in mud. The storm had washed much of the soil away from the mounds. The crosses leaned, glistening with dew. He walked among them slowly, counting under his breath. 9. He paused at the 9th, the wood still damp where his knife had cut into it the night before. The earth here was different, loose, unsettled. He crouched, pressed his hand to the soil, and whispered the old words again. Not for the dead this time, but for what lingered between death and the living. The air seemed to thicken. The wind paused, and then from deep below, he felt it. A pulse faint but steady. He withdrew his hand. "They're not gone," he murmured. Behind him, the marsh made a sound like breath being drawn. In Charleston, word spread quickly. A rider from a neighboring estate claimed the Wexford house had gone silent. No smoke, no servants, no sound but the tide. When the neighboring magistrate sent men to investigate, they found the property deserted. The stables were full, the horses restless and foaming. Inside the mansion, every door stood open, and every candle had burned itself to wax. But what unsettled them most was the mud, streaked across the floors in long, parallel lines, as though something had been dragged. In the dining hall, the table was overturned. The chandelier had fallen and shattered, glass scattered like salt, and on the walls, beneath the smudges of soot, they found faint markings carved into the plaster, circles and spirals, repeating again and again. The men didn't linger. They sent word back to Charleston that the Wexford line had met with some misfortune. No one spoke the word curse, but the silence in their report said enough. That night, Solomon lit a small fire near the graves. He placed 9 wooden bowls around it, each filled with a pinch of salt and ash. From the shadows, a few of the older slaves approached, watching in silence. "What you doing, Sol?" one asked quietly. Solomon didn't look up. "Paying the debt." They didn't ask more. They watched as he took a small piece of cloth, torn from his shirt, and burned it over the flames. The smoke rose straight and gray, twisting into the air before vanishing into the mist. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft. "They buried my name. I buried theirs." The others bowed their heads. None dared to speak the name Wexford aloud. But something was wrong. In the days that followed, the marsh refused to quiet. At night, the wind carried faint sounds from the direction of the graveyard. Not voices exactly, but murmurs. The sound of movement beneath the earth. The slaves avoided the area entirely. Only Solomon went there. He said it was unfinished. He began to carve again. New crosses, smaller this time, each with a single mark. He placed them in a circle around the graves and traced lines in the dirt connecting them. From above, it might have looked like a wheel or a seal. He whispered to the air, his tone no longer pleading, but commanding. Then, on the third night, the ground began to shift. The soil moved as though something beneath it was breathing, slow and shallow. The crosses trembled, and the fire he had lit beside them flickered blue for a moment before dying out completely. Solomon froze. The wind carried a faint sound, not thunder, not water, but the scrape of nails against wood. He fell to his knees and pressed both palms into the ground. "Rest," he whispered. "You've had your vengeance. Now rest." The earth did not answer. A cold wind tore through the clearing, scattering ash across the graves. The mounds quivered once, twice, then stilled. He thought it was over. But as he stood, he saw something new, faint indentations forming in the soft soil, the outline of hands pushing upward. He stepped back, breath caught in his throat. The outlines deepened, then vanished, as though whatever was beneath had withdrawn again. Solomon backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the graves. The marsh had gone too quiet. At dawn, one of the kitchen servants ran to him, trembling. "Saul, you best come look." He followed her to the main house. The front steps were slick with mud, though it hadn't rained. And on the veranda, nailed to one of the columns, was a single wooden cross. One of Solomon's. But this one was carved with his own name. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening. Then he smiled, small, tired, knowing. "They've remembered me," he said. That night, he didn't sleep. He went back to the graveyard one last time, carrying his shovel and the small blade he used for carving. The moon hung low, pale as bone, and the marsh sighed with every tide. He knelt before the 9th grave and began to dig. Not deep, not wide, just enough to disturb the surface. The earth was softer than it should have been. Damp. Warm. He paused, listening. The wind moved through the reeds, whispering fragments of words he almost understood. Then, faintly, a voice, low, hoarse, almost human, said, "Stay." He froze. The soil shifted again, as if something beneath it had moved closer to the surface. He dropped the shovel and stepped back. "Stay." The voice repeated, clearer this time. It wasn't pleading. It was inviting. He turned toward the marsh. The horizon glowed faintly, lightning flashing miles away. He could leave, he thought. Cross the river, vanish into the pines, head north as others had done before him. But his feet wouldn't move. He knelt again. His hand reached toward the dirt. The voice came a third time, soft, almost tender. "Balance." The ground trembled. A breath of cold air rose from the grave, carrying the scent of salt and rot. Solomon closed his eyes. "If it must be," he whispered, "then let it be with me." And as the first light of dawn touched the water, the graves went still. No sound, no wind, only peace, or something that resembled it. "If you've stayed this long, tell me, would you have answered that voice?" The marsh didn't speak for 3 days. The wind stopped, the water stilled, and the air carried that heavy, metallic quiet that follows after a storm has buried something it cannot explain. Solomon didn't come down from the graveyard. The others saw him sometimes, standing at the edge of the water, coat hanging loose, his hands black with soil. At night, they said he spoke with no one but the wind, tracing lines in the dirt with his finger, and whispering names too softly to catch. By the fourth day, the plantation began to rot from the inside. The kitchen fire wouldn't light. The cows refused to feed. Even the flies left the stables, as if the air itself had turned against the living. Old Miriam, who had served the Wexfords longer than most had been alive, said the spirits had closed the book. "The debt's been settled," she whispered. "But the ground still owes interest." That evening, as the sun bled red over the marsh, Soloman carried his shovel to the graves one last time. The soil was sunken now, each mound caving slightly inward, as though whatever lay beneath had exhaled for the final time. He moved from one grave to the next, adjusting each wooden cross until they stood straight. But when he reached the last one, the ninth, he found it tilted forward, its base half buried in muck. He tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge. The ground beneath it was wet, pulsing faintly, like the slow rhythm of a dying heartbeat. He stepped back. Then, quietly, he began to pray. Not in English, but in the tongue his grandmother had whispered to him as a child. A language older than the whip, older than the sea that had carried him here. He prayed until his throat was raw, until the mosquitoes gathered in a cloud around his head, and still the ground moved beneath that last grave. When the wind finally rose, it carried the faint scent of something burning. Not fire, but flesh. In the great house, the magistrate's men had returned to take stock of the estate. They worked fast, avoiding the windows and speaking only when necessary. The rooms smelled wrong, not of decay, but of something older, like wet iron and mildew. In the master's study, they found a ledger still open on the desk. The last entry read only, 9 accounted. 1 remains. Below the line, a dark smear, not ink, not blood, something in between. When they left that evening, none of them spoke until they reached the main road. "Burn it," one said finally. "The whole place, before it spreads." But the others shook their heads. "You don't burn cursed ground," the eldest replied. "You let it drown." And so they left it to the swamp. That night, Solomon built a small fire by the graves and laid his shovel beside him. He sat cross-legged, his shadow flickering across the mounds. "I gave you rest," he whispered. "Don't ask me to join you." The marsh sighed. The fire leaned east, pulled by a wind that came from nowhere. The air grew cold. Then, slowly, the soil beneath the 9th grave began to rise. It didn't burst open. It lifted, steady, deliberate, as though something beneath was pressing upward, slow and patient. The cross tipped forward and fell, landing at Solomon's feet. The shape beneath the soil was human. He rose to his knees, eyes wide, hands trembling. "No," he said softly. "You stay where you belong." But the shape continued to move, the earth cracking along its edges. Solomon reached for the shovel. "I buried you once. Don't make me." The mound split. What came out wasn't flesh, not anymore. The skin was gray, waterlogged, the mouth full of dirt. But the eyes were open, and they were alive. The corpse of Thomas Wexford clawed upward, his jaw moving without sound, his fingers reaching for Solomon's face. Solomon didn't scream. He drove the shovel down with all his strength, the blade splitting the thing's shoulder. It didn't bleed. It only tilted its head, as though studying him. "You should have stayed under," Solomon whispered. Then the wind howled, knocking him backward. The fire went out. In the darkness, dozens of faint, wet sounds rose, the other graves shifting, moving. One by one, Solomon scrambled to his feet, clutching the shovel like a weapon. The moonlight broke through the clouds, revealing the graves. Each one was trembling. The earth was rising again. He didn't stay to watch. He ran, past the oak trees, through the reeds, across the shallow water until his legs burned. Behind him, the sound grew louder, wood splintering, soil collapsing, something dragging itself into the air. When he reached the old footbridge, He turned back once. The graveyard was barely visible through the fog, but he saw enough. 9 dark shapes standing where the crosses had been, still, waiting. And then they turned, all at once, toward him. He dropped the shovel and ran. By morning, no one could find him. The others searched the fields, the slave quarters, the marsh paths. They found his footprints leading to the graveyard, and from there, a single trail of mud heading toward the water. But it stopped halfway across the causeway, as if he'd stepped into the tide and never come out. The 9th cross lay broken at the edge of the marsh. The rest still stood. When the next storm came, it swallowed the plantation completely. The roof caved, the windows shattered, and the graves disappeared under a tide of black water and silt. But the locals still speak of it. On nights when the air smells of rain and the wind comes from the east, they say you can see 9 lanterns moving through the fog. And a 10th, smaller light that follows behind, never quite catching up. They say Soloman walks the marsh still, not as a man, not as a ghost, but as something caught between both. The keeper of balance. And if you hear a voice whisper your name while crossing that water, don't answer, because he might be asking you to dig. The storm didn't arrive like a sudden violence. It crept. It began with a low hum across the marsh, a vibration deep enough to tremble window panes. The sky was swollen and bruised, the horizon a smear of gray-blue rot. By dusk, the wind carried the smell of the tide, salt and decay, seaweed and copper. Inside the Wexford mansion, candles flickered against the tremor of thunder. The house was already half empty. Most of the staff had fled during the last moon, muttering about the graves and the man who spoke to them. But tonight, the remaining Wexfords gathered for what Judge Ambrose called a cleansing feast. It was meant to wash the curse away. 9 men sat around the table, each of the Wexford named Ambrose, Gideon, Elias, Marcus, Henry, Silas, Abram, Charles, and Nathaniel. Their hands gleamed with sweat and wine, their eyes ringed by sleepless nights. They laughed too loudly. They didn't notice the storm beginning to circle above the roof. Eat, Judge Ambrose ordered. Would drink tonight to the end of superstition. To reason. To order. Forks clattered, the silver dull in the candlelight. Behind them, the great doors groaned. The servants, those who remained, lingered by the walls, silent, their eyes down. One young woman dropped a plate. The noise snapped through the hall like a crack of gunfire. Ambrose turned sharply. "Mind yourself, girl." But she didn't answer. Her gaze had drifted toward the tall windows, where lightning flashed white against the panes. And for a moment, she thought she saw someone standing beyond them, a silhouette in the rain, tall, still, watching. When the thunder followed, the figure was gone. The night grew louder. The rain was no longer rain but a curtain of nails, hammering the roof. The wind screamed through the chimneys. The candles stretched long, their flames bending toward the east. Ambrose rose from his chair. "Do you hear that?" The others paused. Beneath the thunder, a second sound, faint, measured, like footsteps on soaked earth. Then came a knock. 3 slow knocks on the great oak doors. The room fell still. Ambrose frowned. At this hour. He turned to one of the servants. "See who it is." The man hesitated, glancing at the windows. "Sir, there's no lanterns outside." "Do as you're told." The servant obeyed. He crossed the hall, his shadow quivering across the walls. When he unlatched the door, a blast of wind and rain burst in, snuffing half the candles. The doorway was empty, but the mud on the threshold was fresh, thick, black, and crawling with small, writhing worms. The servant staggered back. "There's no one there," he whispered. Ambrose's jaw tightened. "Close it." He did. The lock clacked into place. From somewhere beneath the floorboards came a faint thud. Then another, like someone walking slowly beneath them. "Rats," Silas muttered, forcing a grin. "Big ones." No one laughed. The sound grew louder, moving from wall to wall. A rhythmic dragging noise joined it, like something wet being pulled across stone. The candles nearest the door guttered out. Ambrose slammed his hand on the table. Enough of this. He turned to the overseer Henry. Go downstairs. Find what's making that noise. Henry swallowed. You want me to? No. He took a lantern and disappeared into the stairwell. The others waited. The storm raged above them. The air seemed thicker now, heavier. A faint, sweet odor crept into the room, something like flowers long dead. Then, from below, came the first scream. It didn't last long. One single breath of terror, then silence. The lantern fell. Its light swung against the basement wall, casting a wild arc before going dark. Ambrose stood frozen. Then he turned to the others. Nobody moves. They waited. Minutes passed. The silence below was absolute. Then, a soft creak. The door to the basement began to open. The lantern light was gone. Only darkness lingered in the stairwell. Something scraped along the wood. When the door opened fully, the smell came first, swamp water and rot, and then Henry stepped into view. His face was white as milk. His eyes were open but unfocused. Mud streaked his neck and chest. His hands shook as if holding something unseen. Henry, Ambrose whispered. Henry turned his head slowly. His lips parted. There's someone else down there, he said. He said your names. The lightning flashed, and in that brief glare, the others saw his shirt had been torn open. Across his chest, carved deep with something sharp, were 9 marks. 9 cuts forming a perfect circle. Ambrose stumbled backward. Who did that? But Henry didn't answer. He only looked toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. The candles wavered again. And then, from that darkness, came a whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a sound that spoke inside the mind, like breath on glass. You buried me wrong. The air froze. Ambrose spun, scanning the walls. Who's there? But the whisper came again, closer now. You left me in the rain. Gideon drew his pistol. His hand trembled. Show yourself. The window behind him shattered. Rain burst in, followed by a gust of wind that knocked over the candelabra. The room plunged into darkness. When the thunder came, they saw him. Just for a blink. A tall shape standing at the center of the table. Mud dripping from its fingers. A shovel in its hand. And then the light was gone. What followed was confusion, panic, screams. Chairs crashed. The gun fired once, hitting nothing. The storm roared louder than the men. Something moved between them fast. The air grew cold wherever it passed. The candles sputtered back to life for an instant. And Ambrose saw his brother Gideon's face, twisted in horror, his mouth open, his throat slick with mud. Another flash. Elias on the floor, convulsing, eyes wide and glassy. Another. Charles pinned against the wall, his head tilted at an impossible angle. The light vanished again. Ambrose stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the soaked carpet. His hand brushed the table, wet, sticky. He looked down. Not wine. Blood. He screamed for the others, but no one answered. The only sound now was the shovel's metal edge scraping across the floor. Soloman. He breathed. God help us, Soloman. The whisper came from behind him. God was watching, Judge. He just didn't stop me. The shovel rose. By dawn, the storm had passed. The mansion stood still, its windows shattered, its door swinging open with the tide. Inside, the table was overturned. The dishes lay broken. The wine spilled dark across the rug. No bodies. No footprints leaving the hall. Only 9 empty chairs, each seat wet, as though someone had just risen from it. And in the center of the room, a single cross carved into the floorboards. When the sun rose, the marsh steamed. Birds returned to the trees, and at the edge of the Wexford graveyard, the soil glistened wet and new. 9 mounds, freshly turned. Each cross bore a name carved by hand, and beside them stood a shovel, upright, half sunk in the mud. No one ever saw Soloman again. But some nights, when the tide recedes and the mist crawls low, you can hear the faint scrape of iron against stone, steady, patient, unhurried. Digging. Always digging. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. By morning, Charleston had swallowed the news in silence. The storm had been too wild, the damage too broad. A dozen plantations ruined, Boats capsized, fields drowned. The Wexford estate lay somewhere beyond the flood line, unreachable for days. No one hurried to check on them. People in the city preferred to let certain places stay quiet. When the clouds cleared, a group of debt collectors and surveyors finally made their way down the marsh road. They found the gates broken, the iron twisted as if by hands too strong for flesh. The oaks lining the path had been stripped bare, not by wind, but by fire. The mansion loomed through the mist, its roof torn, windows black. The front door hung from a single hinge. Inside, the air was wrong. It smelled of wet wood, wine and something else, old meat, copper, and stagnant water. The floors glistened faintly, as if the walls themselves had begun to sweat. "Lord in heaven," one man muttered, stepping into the hall. What happened here? The main dining room was chaos. The chairs were overturned, the table split in half, the chandelier shattered across the floor. Plates were ground to powder underfoot. But there was no blood, no bodies, and yet the sound of them lingered, faint and echoing, like a dinner still in progress somewhere just out of sight. Laughter, the clink of glass, a low hum of conversation rising and falling behind the walls. "Do you hear that?" one of the men whispered. The others didn't answer. They explored cautiously, splitting into pairs. In the corridor leading to the servant quarters, the wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing dark stains beneath. Patterns like fingerprints pressed deep into the plaster. The cellar door was swollen shut. When they pried it open, the stench rolled out in a heavy wave. The first man gagged. "God, something's rotting." They lifted their lanterns. The floor below was covered in a thin film of water. Floating in it were scraps of clothing, coats, shoes, a lace cuff still buttoned. And in the far corner, something metallic gleamed, a shovel. The handle had been sanded smooth by use. The blade was clean, too clean. The men left the cellar untouched and made their way upstairs. Every room bore signs of struggle. Gudges on the floorboards, torn curtains, a mirror cracked down the middle. In one of the guest rooms, a cradle sat in the corner, its interior filled with black water. On the walls above it, 9 small handprints had been pressed into the plaster. Each print was deep enough to leave the shape of nails. When they reached the master's study, they found the ledger open again, the same one Ambrose had written in weeks before. This time, the ink had bled through several pages, warping the paper. The last entry was still visible, 9 accounted. 1 remains. But beneath it, faint and crooked, someone had added another line. "He dug for us, we dig for him." The men stared at it, then closed the book and backed away. No one spoke for a long time. As dusk fell, they decided to leave. The house had begun to creak as the tide returned, the wind slipping through every shattered window. But when they reached the front door, it slammed shut before they touched it. The latch dropped. The air inside the hall shifted. Colder now, damp and heavy. "Who did that?" one shouted. Another lantern flickered out. Then came the whisper. Not from behind them. From above. The ceiling groaned. Dust sifted down. A slow dragging sound began overhead. Footsteps crossing the floor of the master's bedroom, then pausing directly above where they stood. The men looked up. The ceiling bulged inward. Not breaking, just swelling as though the boards themselves were breathing. Something dripped. A single drop hit the shoulder of the youngest man. It left a brown stain that smelled faintly of salt water. He wiped it off. "We have to go," he whispered. But the others had already gone still, because the laughter had started again. Faint, muffled, coming from the walls. The same laugh they'd heard before. The same voices. Only this time, it wasn't echo. It was answering them. One of the men bolted for the back corridor. The others followed, tripping over broken furniture. Doors they hadn't opened began to swing wide, one after another, as if the house itself were showing them the way. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, the end of it lost in shadows. Their lanterns barely reached 10 feet ahead. Then, from the far end, came a flicker of light. "Someone's there," one whispered. It was a figure, faint, glowing faintly gold. The outline of a man, tall, bare-headed, standing beside a door that shouldn't have existed. He turned his face toward them. And though the features were wrong, pale, shifting, they could all see his eyes empty, deep as water. The youngest man took a step forward. "Soloman," he breathed. The figure tilted its head, then raised its hand. The walls shook. Every door in the corridor burst open. Behind each door was darkness, not the kind you find at night, but something older, thicker, as though the air had been replaced with water. The men fell to their knees, choking, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. One tried to pray. The words turned to bubbles. The last thing any of them heard, before the world went black, was the sound of the sea. The crash of waves in a house 10 miles from the coast. When neighbors finally came searching days later, they found the front door ajar again. The surveyor's horses were gone. Inside, the rooms were dry, quiet, and untouched. Only one thing had changed. The shovel in the cellar now stood upright, driven through the ledger. And above the mantel in the dining hall, someone had carved 9 words into the wood. The house remembers every hand that fed it. That night, the tide flooded farther inland than it ever had before. Locals said they saw lanterns bobbing near the Wexford ruins, moving in circles through the fog. No one went closer. No one wanted to hear if the house was still laughing. If you've stayed this long, would you have stepped inside? The morning after the storm broke over the Carolina coast, a thick mist clung to the marshlands. From a distance, the Wexford estate looked like a ruin swallowed whole by the tide, its chimneys jutting from the fog like the ribs of a half-drowned beast. It was the slaves from the neighboring plantation who came first, not the masters, not the law. The enslaved had heard the storm's cries. They said the thunder had called out names. And when dawn came, they walked the flooded path barefoot, carrying nothing but a single lantern among them. They didn't speak. When they reached the graveyard, the air was colder. The mist there wasn't just fog. It was breath, slow, rhythmic, rising from the ground. The 9 graves were freshly turned. The crosses, once straight, leaned toward the east, as though bowing to something unseen. The soil was slick, black, and wet, but there were no footprints leading away. And in the center, the shovel stood upright. Its blade was clean. Its handle glistened with moisture, though the rain had stopped hours ago. Someone had placed it there, carefully, like an offering. Miriam was the first to step forward. Her gray hair hung loose, her dress clinging to her ankles. She had known Soloman since he arrived from the coast years ago. She had watched him dig graves for the Wexfords, watched him bury their cruelty with quiet, measured hands. Now she touched the shovel and closed her eyes. "It's finished," she whispered. "He's done what the Lord wouldn't." The others murmured behind her, uncertain whether to pray or flee. A boy, too young to know fear the way adults did, asked softly, "Miss Miriam, where did he go?" She looked toward the marsh. The tide had crept higher, swallowing the lower fields, turning the land into a mirror of gray water. "He went home," she said, "or somewhere that listens better than men." By midday, word reached the city. The Wexfords were gone, vanished. The magistrate sent a small party to investigate, 3 men and a priest. They arrived before sunset, their boots sinking into the mud. When they saw the graves, they removed their hats. The priest crossed himself twice. 9 graves, 9 names carved in rough lettering: Ambrose, Gideon, Elias, Marcus, Henry, Silas, Abram, Charles, Nathaniel. No bodies had yet been exhumed, but the air above each mound seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from a road. The magistrate squinted. The crosses? Who carved them? No one answered. He gestured to his men. "Dig one up." The priest hesitated. "Sir, perhaps we should pray first." "Pray while you work." The first shovel struck the ground. The soil was soft, loose, easy to move. Too easy. They dug several feet, expecting the thud of a coffin lid. But the earth gave way to nothing. The hole was empty. No body, no wood, just a faint smell of salt. The magistrate frowned. "Try another." They moved to the next grave, same result. Then the next, all 9. Each grave was hollow, each one perfectly dug. When the last mound was opened, the men stepped back, their faces pale. The priest whispered, "Maybe they weren't buried. Maybe they crawled out." As the sun dipped behind the tree line, the tide began to rise again, faster than expected. The marsh flooded in slow, creeping waves, swallowing their boot tracks and filling the open graves with murky water. The magistrate cursed and signaled to leave, but before they reached the gate, a low groan rolled through the air. Deep, guttural, coming from beneath their feet. The ground trembled. The graves began to bubble. "Move," one of the men shouted, but it was too late. The nearest hole burst open, spitting mud and black water into the air. Something pale surfaced. A hand, then another, gripping the edges of the pit. The priest dropped his Bible, but when the figure pulled itself up, there was no flesh, no skin, just mud shaped like a man, hollow-eyed and dripping. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was the crash of the sea. The magistrate fired his pistol, the shot echoing through the fog, but the figure didn't fall. It only turned its head, slowly, as though listening to something far away. Then it sank back into the grave, vanishing beneath the water. The marsh fell silent again. The men fled without looking back. By the time they reached Charleston, the storm clouds were forming again. The magistrate wrote his report that night. It was brief. Wexford Estate, destroyed by flood and fire. 9 graves, no remains. The land unfit for cultivation. Recommend abandonment. The priest refused to sign it. He left the city the next morning. Weeks passed. The estate remained deserted. The water refused to drain. The crops rotted. At night, fishermen along the coast claimed to see faint lights moving inland. 9, sometimes 10, bobbing along the horizon like lanterns. When they drew closer, the lights vanished, replaced by the sound of slow, rhythmic digging. They said the ground still breathes there, that when the wind blows from the east, it carries a whisper with it. He dug for us, we dig for him. Years later, when a pair of surveyors were hired to chart the land for sale, they found the fields overgrown and silent. No birds, no crickets. Even the frogs had gone. They reached the graveyard just before dusk. The crosses were still there, half rotted, leaning, and beside them, the shovel. One of the men touched the handle. It was cold as stone. The other knelt, brushing away the dirt around the blade. "Strange," he murmured. "No rust at all." The wind shifted. Behind them, the marsh rippled. They turned, and saw a ripple spreading through the grass, like something large moving just beneath the surface of the land. "Animal?" one asked, but the other shook his head. "No, it's under the ground." The ripple stopped. Then, from the edge of the graveyard, came a sound, a slow, steady scrape of metal. The shovel tilted. No one touched it. It leaned forward, then fell, blade first into the nearest mound. The soil shifted, just slightly, as though something beneath it had sighed. The men ran. By morning, the shovel was upright again. Some said the marsh lifted it. Others said Soloman did. No one returned to find out. And still, after all these years, the locals warn travelers not to cross that stretch of land after dark. They say the ground there doesn't stay still. It swells and moves as though something beneath it refuses to sleep. If you stand long enough, you can hear it breathing. And if you listen closer, you'll hear another sound, faint, far away, the scrape of a shovel. Slow, patient, eternal. Would you have dared to stay? By the spring of 1824, the Wexford estate no longer existed on any living map. The land had been marked abandoned by the magistrate, and when anyone tried to find it again, they found only water, reeds, and silence. The road that once led to its gates had sunk beneath the mud, swallowed whole like the memory of those who built it. But the marsh remembered. The marsh remembers everything. When the rains came, they fell differently over that part of Charleston County. Harder, heavier, as though the sky itself was trying to wash away a sin it couldn't name. The water pooled where the great house once stood, drowning the chimneys in silt. Cypress roots crawled through windows and door frames like skeletal fingers. Each night, the tide crept a little higher. Each morning, the land sank a little deeper. Locals said the soil there had turned black as tar. Crows wouldn't land. Even the wind went quiet. Travelers passing the edge of the marsh began to report strange things. One man swore he saw a staircase rising from the mud, perfectly preserved, leading to nowhere. Another found the frame of a door standing alone in the reeds. A door that opened and closed though no one touched it. And then there were the graves. They never stayed buried. Each storm rearranged them, shifting the mounds into new patterns. Crosses moved. Names vanished. Sometimes there were 9 graves, sometimes 10, sometimes none at all. No one dared to mark the difference. In midsummer, a fisherman named Harlan Weaver set up his net near the edge of the old property, just before dawn. He claimed the fish swarmed there. Bigger, fatter, feeding on something in the mud. When the tide went out, he saw bones glinting in the silt. He thought they were animal. But when he bent closer, he saw teeth, human, white and whole, staring up at him through the gray water. He dropped his net and ran. By the time he reached Charleston, his hands were shaking too hard to untie his boat. He told the harbor master that the marsh had a heartbeat, that he felt it pulse through the water like something alive. No one believed him. But that night, another storm rolled in, sudden, without warning. The same night the sea rose higher than it had in years. The next morning, the marsh stretched half a mile farther inland. The fisherman's house was gone. All that remained was his boat, floating upside down in the shallows. As months passed, strange tides began to pull at the coastline. The marsh grew wider, swallowing farms and fences. The soil became slick and glassy, reflecting faces that weren't there. Some said the water had memory. Others said it had hunger. But the old ones, the ones who remembered Soloman, said it had justice. They said the spirits he called had not gone home. They had built a kingdom beneath the water, made of silence and death. Every wrong buried in that soil would rise again, until the land itself was clean. In 1830, a group of surveyors returned. They tried to chart the land for a railroad, but their maps came out wrong. Lines twisting back on themselves, rivers appearing where none should be, compasses spun without direction. That night, the youngest of them woke to a sound outside his tent, a soft, wet thud. He thought it was rain. But when he looked out, he saw the graves again, 9 mounds, and the shovel, just standing there in the moonlight. He turned to wake the others, but when he looked back, the graves were gone. Only the sound remained, slow, steady, rhythmic. Thud. Drag. Like someone digging. He left before dawn. By 1840, the Wexford estate was gone entirely. What remained was a gray, green expanse of water and reeds that locals began to call Solomon's Tide. Fishermen avoided it. Animals skirted around it. The air itself felt heavier there, as though burdened by memory. Some nights, travelers along the coast claimed they could still see lights glowing deep in the marsh. Not lanterns, but faint, flickering orbs, moving in a perfect circle before vanishing into the mist. And if you stood on the bank long enough, you might hear voices beneath the water. Not screams, not cries, just a low chant, in a language no one had spoken in 100 years. A prayer for the buried, a curse for the living. The marsh took back everything that once belonged to the Wexfords. Their land, their legacy, their name. But it never took Soloman. Some say he's still there, walking the tide at dusk, shovel in hand, the mud not swallowing him but parting for him. As though the earth itself remembers the man who taught it how to breathe. They say if you whisper your own sins into that wind, the marsh will listen. And if it deems you honest, it will let you leave. But if it doesn't, you'll sink quietly, without a ripple. Because the marsh does not forgive, it only balances. And Soloman never stopped digging. By 1892, Charleston had changed. The city had risen from its ashes more than once. War, flood, fire, plague. And yet, some parts of it refused rebirth. The marshlands west of the Ashley River still lay undisturbed, their edges dark with moss and memory. Locals didn't fish there. They didn't build there. The children who grew up hearing the name Wexford whispered it like a curse, not a story. But progress has no memory. So when the South Carolina Land Survey Commission decided to map the region for a new railway extension, they sent a team of 6 men to the marsh. They were engineers, cartographers, and laborers. City men with clean hands and sharper boots. None of them believed in ghosts. They arrived in June, when the heat sat thick as syrup on the air. The reeds towered over them. The water glistened with a metallic sheen, as though the soil bled from within. The first day went fine. They drove their stakes, drew their lines, and laughed about the old swamp stories the locals warned them about. The second night, they found the graves, 9 mounds, low and rounded, arranged in a near-perfect semicircle. The crosses were almost gone, eaten by rot and time, but the wood beneath the moss still held carved letters. Ambrose, Gideon, Amias, Marcus, Henry, Silas, Abram, Charles, Nathaniel, and in the middle of them all, barely upright in the soft earth, was a rusted shovel. The men thought it was fascinating, a relic of the antebellum days, proof of history lost. They decided to dig, thinking they might uncover valuables or even evidence of an old crime. By dusk, they had opened the first coffin. The lid came off easily, though the air that escaped from within was foul enough to send one man vomiting into the reeds. But there was no body, only a dark, hollow impression of something that had once been human. At the bottom lay a wooden charm, carved with swirling patterns none of them recognized. The second coffin was harder. Nails had been driven deep, from the inside out. When they pried it open, the wood splintered, and something heavy shifted beneath the dirt. Inside was a skeleton curled tight, its hands clawing toward the lid, fingernails worn down to bone. The third coffin had 2 sets of handprints on the inside of the lid. That was when one of the men, an older surveyor named Dillard, suggested they stop. He said the graves weren't ordinary, that the land itself didn't want to be disturbed. But curiosity, like greed, doesn't listen to fear. They kept digging. By midnight, all 9 coffins were unearthed. The lanterns burned low, their flames bending toward the soil as if drawn by breath. That's when they heard it, a sound too faint to name at first. A low, dragging thump beneath the ground. Then another. Then another. One of the laborers swore the mounds behind them had changed shape. Another said he saw the shovel move. Just an inch. But it moved against the wind. Dillard began to pray in a whisper. And then the lids started to shake. The first one rattled, softly at first, then violently. Nails popped loose. The second trembled as though something inside was trying to push upward. The third let out a sound that none of them could explain. A hollow gasp, like a breath drawn through centuries of dirt. The lanterns went out all at once. The men ran. By the time they reached the tree line, only 4 of the 6 remained. Dillard fell behind, swallowed by the fog. Another tripped in the mud and didn't rise again. The survivors stumbled into town at dawn, drenched, trembling, unable to speak. Their faces had gone gray. Their clothes smelled not of marsh water, but of decay. When the authorities returned to the site a week later, they found no sign of graves, no coffins, no shovel, but the soil was fresh, recently turned, and at the center of the clearing stood 9 new crosses. After that, the land was officially declared unstable. The railway was rerouted. No further work was attempted. In the archives of Charleston's Historical Society, a report still sits, dated July 1892, signed by a man named Harlan Dillard, one of the last survivors. It ends with a single, handwritten note in the margin. They were not buried. They were sealed. And they are not done breathing. Even now, on storm nights when thunder walks across the coast, locals swear the marsh still shifts. Lantern lights appear where no hands hold them. Sometimes, faint voices rise from the water, chanting, calling, counting to 9, and if you stand there long enough, you might feel it too. A slow, rhythmic thud beneath your feet, like a heartbeat, or a shovel striking earth. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. Would you have dug them up? Would you have looked inside? The story of the Wexfords isn't really about vengeance. It's about the weight of memory, the kind that seeps into the soil and refuses to leave. Some places never forget what was done upon them. Some names echo even when no one speaks them. If you listen to the wind along the coast of Charleston, you can still hear the whisper of that name, Soloman. It doesn't sound angry. It sounds tired, like someone who has finally finished their work, but still stands watch just in case the balance shifts again. The marsh remains, the graves remain, and on certain nights, when the fog is low and the moonlight touches the water just right, you might see the faint outline of a man standing knee-deep in the tide, holding a rusted shovel like a lantern. He doesn't move, he doesn't speak, but the air around him feels heavy with silence. Maybe he's still guarding the line between the living and the buried. Or maybe he's waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb the quiet again. So, if you ever find yourself near the old Wexford marshes, do yourself a kindness. Don't look for the graves. Don't follow the lights. And if the ground starts to move beneath your feet, run. Because the marsh remembers everything. Like, share, and subscribe if you made it this far. And don't forget to comment below where you're watching from and at what time. Tell me what topic the next story should be about. The ones who stayed till the end. You're the bravest. I'm surprised you're still here. End of story. Sleep if you can.